A billionaire disguised as a homeless man walked into his own flagship restaurant and ordered a $200 steak just to see if the values he built his empire on were still alive. He was sneered at, humiliated, and quietly marked for something far worse than rejection. When the plate was set before him, a black waitress who could barely afford her daughter's medication risked everything to slip a small piece of paper into his weathered hand. He unfolded it and froze completely. Not from shock, but because in that single sentence someone had just saved his life and handed him the evidence to burn his own kingdom to the ground. But what did the note say? The clothes Ramiro Bingham wore that evening were older than most of his managers, 35 years old to be exact. A faded brown jacket with holes at the elbows, and pants that still carried the faint stench of the streets he once called home. He kept them locked in the back of his penthouse closet, buried beneath rows of Italian suits worth more than his dishwashers made in a month. Tonight, for the first time in over 3 decades, he pulled them on again. His head of security, Marcus, stood by the elevator, watching him smear dirt across his graying beard. Marcus had been with him for 9 years and had seen Ramiro close billion-dollar deals without flinching, but this was different. "You could send an auditor," Marcus said carefully, "someone trained in undercover operations." Ramiro looked at him through the reflection in the glass. "No auditor has the scar I have." He touched the back of his left hand, a pale, puckered mark where boiling water had been poured on him by a chef 35 years ago for daring to beg for scraps. The anonymous email had arrived 6 days ago. No name, just a grainy video clip and 2 lines of text. The video showed a man in tattered clothes being dragged out of a restaurant by 2 security guards, while well-dressed diners looked on with amused disgust. The message read, "Your flagship, your reputation, your responsibility, or isn't it?" The restaurant was his crown jewel, the very first location he'd opened after clawing his way out of poverty. The quarterly reports blamed declining performance on market saturation and demographic shifts. But Ramiro had built his empire on one unshakable principle. That note saved his life. But what it cost Florence? You're about to find out. Like this video if you believe in justice. Subscribe if you believe in courage. Comment dignity. If you believe everyone, and I mean everyone, deserves respect. Now let me tell you how we got here. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried beneath 147 unread messages in Ramiro's personal inbox, the one only 5 people in the world had access to. He almost deleted it. The subject line was blank, the sender address a string of random numbers and letters that screamed spam or phishing attempt. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the timestamp, 3:47 a.m., the hour when ghosts whispered. He clicked, no greeting, no signature, just a video file and 2 sentences that hit him like a fist to the sternum. Your flagship, your reputation, your responsibility. Or isn't it? Ramiro's hand hovered over the mouse. The scar on his left hand began to ache, a phantom pain that only appeared when his past came calling. He pressed play. The video was grainy, clearly shot on a phone from across a dining room he recognized immediately. Crystal chandeliers, burgundy leather booths, the original location, his flagship. A man in ragged clothes sat alone at a corner table, hunched over a menu like he was trying to disappear into it. Within seconds, 2 security guards flanked him. The audio was muffled, but Ramiro could read the body language, the aggressive postures, the pointing toward the door, the way the man's shoulders collapsed in humiliation. Then the guards grabbed him. Not gently. They hauled him up by his arms and dragged him past tables where men in $1,000 suits and women dripping in diamonds watched with expressions ranging from disgust to amusement. One woman actually laughed, covering her mouth with her napkin. The man's shoes scraped against the marble floor Ramiro had personally selected 35 years ago because he wanted every guest, to feel like royalty when they walked through those doors. The video ended with the man being shoved through the exit into the rain. Ramiro sat in his office on the 47th floor, staring at the frozen final frame. His reflection stared back at him from the dark screen, clean-shaven, tailored, powerful, everything he'd fought to become. But in that grainy video, he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he'd been at 19. Dirty, desperate, invisible to everyone except those who wanted to remove him from their sight. He read the message again. Your responsibility, or isn't it? The question burned. Because he knew the answer. He'd always known it. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. I need the clothes from storage, he said. The ones from 89. Sir? The jacket, the pants, everything. Ramiro's jaw tightened. I'm going back. There was a long pause on the other end. Marcus had been with him long enough to know when an argument would be futile. When? Marcus asked quietly. Ramiro looked at the frozen image on his screen, at the man being thrown into the rain, at the diners who'd watched like it was dinner theater. Friday night. Prime time. He closed his laptop. I want to see their true faces when they think no one important is watching. He didn't sleep that night. The scar on his hand wouldn't let him. Florence Wilson's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., the same as it had every morning for the past 2 years. She silenced it before the second beep, her hand moving on autopilot in the darkness. In the next room, she could hear Destiny's breathing, labored, whistling slightly on the exhale, the sound that never let her sleep deeply, even when exhaustion pulled at her bones. She dressed quietly in the uniform she'd washed in the sink the night before. White button-down, black slacks, the apron that still smelled faintly of truffle oil and someone else's expensive perfume. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman 10 years older than her 32 years. The bags under her eyes had bags. Before leaving, she checked on Destiny. Her daughter was curled beneath a thin blanket, her inhaler on the nightstand within arm's reach. Florence pressed her lips to the girl's forehead, warm but not feverish. Thank God. The last ER visit had cost her a week's wages, even with insurance. She left a note on the kitchen table for Mrs. Chen next door. Back by 11. Lunch money in the jar. Make sure she takes the blue inhaler at 9. The morning shift at the flagship was supposed to end at 2 p.m., but Ronald, the manager, had made it clear that supposed to and reality were different things in his restaurant. If you wanted to keep your hours, you stayed when he told you to stay. You smiled when he told you to smile. You pretended not to notice when he pocketed cash from the register, or when he screamed at the busboys in Spanish he thought they couldn't understand. Florence had learned to make herself invisible, competent enough to keep, invisible enough to survive. By 10 a.m., her feet were already aching. By noon, she'd served 43 tables, been stiffed on tips twice, and had to remake an order because a customer claimed her water tasted poor. By 2 p.m., when her shift should have ended, Ronald appeared with his clipboard and that smile that never reached his eyes. Florence, I need you for the dinner rush, Candace called out. It wasn't a request. I have to pick up my daughter. Then I guess you need to decide what's more important, your job or your babysitting problem. The words hit like a slap. She thought of Destiny's prescription refill, due in 4 days, $73 she didn't have. She thought of the collection agency calling about last month's urgent care visit. I'll stay, she whispered. Ronald's smile widened. Good girl, you're on Section 7 tonight, the VIPs. He walked away, like already dismissing her from his mind. Florence called Mrs. Chen from the break room, her hands shaking. I'm so sorry. Can you keep her until 10? I'll pay you extra. Don't worry about money, honey. Just take care of yourself. But Florence couldn't afford to take care of herself. She could only afford to survive. She splashed cold water on her face, reapplied the lipstick that was supposed to make her look presentable, and returned to the floor. 6 more hours. She could do 6 more hours. She had to. Destiny's breathing depended on it. Ramiro arrived at 7:47 p.m., precisely when he knew the dining room would be at its most crowded. Marcus had dropped him off 3 blocks away, per his instructions. He wanted to walk, wanted to feel the weight of the streets again, the way strangers' eyes slid past him like he was made of air. It was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked through the holes in his jacket within minutes. Perfect. He looked exactly how he needed to look, desperate, dirty, and beneath notice. The mahogany doors gleamed under the golden awning lights. Through the glass, he could see the dining room he'd designed with his own hands 3 decades ago. Men in tailored suits, women in cocktail dresses, the soft glow of candles on white tablecloths, the murmur of wealth. He reached for the brass handle, The hostess saw him before he made it 2 steps inside. No, her name tag read Claire, and her smile, the professional one she'd been trained to wear, evaporated the moment her eyes traveled from his face to his clothes. She actually took a step back, her hand moving instinctively to the phone at her podium. "Sir," the word came out sharp like a warning. "This is a private establishment." "I'd like a table," Ramiro said quietly. Claire's expression shifted from alarm to something colder, disgust poorly masked as concern. "I'm sorry, but we have a dress code. I can pay." He pulled a crumpled $50 bill from his pocket, money that had been clean this morning but that he'd deliberately soiled. "I just want dinner." The dining room had gone quieter. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the tables like a wave. Ramiro could feel their stares like insects crawling across his skin. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Claire's hand hovered over the phone. We can't accommodate walk-ins tonight. You have 3 empty tables." Ramiro gestured toward the back corner. "Right there. Those are reserved." They weren't. He could see the unmarked reservation cards from where he stood. Then Ronald Doxey emerged from the kitchen corridor, his face already arranged in an expression of theatrical patience. He was younger than Ramiro expected, mid-40s, slicked-back hair, a suit that was too expensive for a manager's salary. When he saw Ramiro, something flickered behind his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition of a type. A problem to be eliminated. "Sir," Ronald's voice carried across the dining room, deliberately loud enough for the guests to hear. "I'm the manager here. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." He moved closer, lowering his voice to a hiss meant only for Ramiro. "We don't serve vagrants. Leave now, or I'll have security remove you." "I have money," Ramiro repeated. Ronald's lip curled. "I don't care if you have the Queen's jewelry in those filthy pockets. You smell like the gutter, and you're disturbing my guests." He snapped his fingers toward the bar. "Thompson, escort this gentleman outside." But before the security guard could move, Ramiro spoke again, his voice steady. "I want to order the ribeye, the $200 one." He placed $300 bills on Claire's podium. The dining room fell completely silent. Ronald stared at the money, his jaw working. Ramiro could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The bills were real. But accepting them meant admitting this homeless man belonged in his dining room. Finally, Ronald smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just decided something cruel. "Of course, sir," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Right this way." Ronald pushed through the kitchen doors with enough force to make them slam against the walls. The sous chef, Edward Hester, looked up from the salmon he was plating, his hands automatically steadying. "Table 12, Ronald said, his voice low and sharp. "The vagrant. He ordered the ribeye." Edward nodded, already reaching for the refrigerated case where the prime cuts were stored. His hand was halfway to the handle when Ronald's voice stopped him cold. "Not that one." Edward turned. Ronald was pointing toward the back prep station, where a steak sat uncovered on a steel tray. Edward had pulled it from rotation that morning, 4 hours past safety guidelines, the edges starting to gray, the smell just beginning to turn. "That's spoiled," Edward said carefully. "I was about to dispose of it." "Perfect." Ronald's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Plate it, nice and pretty. He won't know the difference." The kitchen noise seemed to fade, the sizzle of pans, the shouted orders, the clatter of plates. Edward felt his stomach drop. "Ronald, I can't." "Can't?" Ronald stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. "Edward, let me explain something to you. That filth out there walked into my dining room, embarrassed my hostess, and made my guests uncomfortable. He wants to play rich? Fine, let him eat like the rat he is. It's against health code. If he gets sick, he's a homeless drunk who ate something bad from a dumpster. Who's going to believe him?" Ronald's eyes narrowed. "But you know what people will believe? That my sous chef can't follow simple instructions. That maybe he's been cutting corners. Maybe he's been stealing from inventory." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Edward thought of Sarah, 7 months pregnant, sitting at home with her swollen feet elevated. He thought of the second bedroom they'd just started painting pale yellow. He thought of the hospital bills that were coming, the life insurance he'd finally been able to afford, the stability he'd clawed his way toward after years of working double shifts in kitchens that didn't care if he lived or died. "Don't do this," Edward said quietly. Ronald leaned against the counter, pulling out his phone. "You have a choice, Edward. You can cook the steak I'm telling you to cook, or you can clean out your locker tonight. And I'll make sure every restaurant owner in this city knows you were fired for theft. See how Sarah feels about that." He paused. "How far along is she now? 7 months? 8? The words were a blade between his ribs. Edward looked at the spoiled meat. He looked at the kitchen full of staff who'd gone carefully quiet, pretending not to hear. He looked at Ronald, who was already scrolling through his phone like the conversation was over. "Please," Edward whispered, "just let me use a fresh cut. I'll cook it however you want, This isn't a negotiation." Ronald's voice went flat. "Cook the steak, or lose everything." Edward's hands were shaking as he reached for the contaminated meat. The smell hit him first, faint but unmistakable, the sweetness of rot just beginning to bloom. He felt bile rise in his throat. Across the kitchen, Florence was filling water glasses, her back to them. She didn't know. Nobody knew except him and Ronald. Edward turned on the burner, the flame hissing to life. "Good boy," Ronald said and walked out. Edward stood there, the ruined steak in his hand, and hated himself for every second he didn't throw it in the trash. Florence had been refilling water glasses near the kitchen door when she heard it. Ronald's voice, low and vicious, seeping through the crack where the door didn't quite close. She wouldn't have stopped. She'd learned long ago that hearing too much could cost you everything. But then she heard Edward's voice break on a single word. "Please." She'd frozen, the water pitcher sweating against her palm. "Cook the steak, or lose everything." Florence's breath caught. She shifted slightly, enough to see through the narrow window in the door. Edward stood at the prep station, his shoulders hunched in defeat, holding something in his hand. Even from here, she could see his hands shaking. Ronald walked past her a moment later, that satisfied smile on his face, and didn't even glance in her direction. She was invisible to him. She'd always been invisible to him, but invisibility had its advantages. Florence pushed into the kitchen, moving quickly to the dish station like she belonged there. Edward had his back to her, the burner already lit, that piece of meat in the pan. The smell hit her immediately. Underneath the searing butter and rosemary, something else, something wrong. She felt her stomach turn. Edward must have sensed her presence because he glanced back, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. What she saw there wasn't defiance or malice. It was shame so deep it looked like grief. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing it anyway. Florence backed out of the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of the homeless man at table 12, sitting alone in his ragged jacket while the dining room whispered around him. She thought of Ronald's smile. She thought of destiny, wheezing in her sleep, dependent on medication that cost more than Florence could afford to lose. She should keep walking, serve her tables, collect her tips, go home. But her feet carried her to the staff bathroom instead. The lock clicked behind her, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. The bathroom was the only place in the entire restaurant without cameras. Ronald had complained about the cost. It was the only place where secrets could still exist. Florence pulled a guest check pad from her apron pocket, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the pen. What was she doing? If Ronald found out, she'd be fired. Worse than fired. He'd make sure she never worked in this city again. She thought of Destiny's inhaler, the $73 she didn't have. She thought of the man at table 12, about to eat poison meant to punish him for being poor. She thought of who she wanted to be versus who survival had forced her to become. The pen touched paper. Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional. 6 words. 6 words that would either save a stranger's life or destroy her own. Florence folded the note into a small square, her hands still shaking. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, at the exhausted woman in a borrowed uniform, at the mother who couldn't afford to be brave, at the human being who couldn't afford not to be. She slipped the note into her apron pocket and unlocked the door. Edward was plating the steak when she returned, arranging asparagus and baby potatoes around the contaminated meat like he was creating art. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "Table 12, he said to no one in particular, his voice hollow. Florence picked up the plate, felt its weight in her hands. Ronald was watching from his station near the bar, arms crossed, waiting. Florence walked toward table 12. and with every step she felt the note burning against her hip like a live coal. Ramiro had been seated for 23 minutes, long enough to feel every stare in the dining room like pinpricks on his skin. The couple at the next table had moved, requested a different section, whispering to their server about the smell. A businessman in a gray suit had taken a photo of him with his phone, not even trying to be subtle about it. This was what he'd come to see. This was what he'd needed to witness with his own eyes, and it was so much worse than he'd imagined. When Florence appeared carrying his plate, he noticed her hands first. They were trembling, barely perceptible, but he'd spent 35 years reading people in boardrooms and negotiations. This woman was terrified. "Your ribeye, sir," she said quietly, setting the plate down with care that seemed almost reverent. The steak looked perfect. Seared crust, the pink center, garnished with rosemary and sea salt, $200 of precision plating. Ramiro felt his mouth water despite everything, a Pavlovian response to decades of fine dining. "Thank you," he said. Florence didn't leave. She stood there for a heartbeat too long, her body angled so that Ronald, stationed near the bar like a general surveying his troops, couldn't see her hands. Then she reached forward, ostensibly to adjust his napkin, and pressed something small and folded into his palm. Her eyes met his. There was a message in them, desperate and clear. Read it. Now. Then she was gone, moving back toward the kitchen with the same practiced invisibility he'd watched her employ all evening. Ramiro unfolded the note beneath the table, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. "Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional." The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He stared at the steak on his plate, the beautiful poison thing that someone in his kitchen had prepared to harm him, not to refuse him service, not to embarrass him, to actually poison him. The scar on his left hand began to throb, that phantom pain that only appeared when his past collided with his present. He was 19 again, collapsed in an alley behind a restaurant, his hand screaming where the chef had poured boiling water on him for daring to beg. He remembered the man's voice. "You're not human. You're trash. And trash doesn't eat here." 35 years later, in a restaurant he'd built with his own scarred hands, nothing had changed, except now the cruelty wore a suit and called itself management. Ramiro looked up, his eyes finding Ronald across the room. The manager was watching him, waiting. That smile still played at the corners of his mouth, anticipation mixed with contempt. He wanted Ramiro to eat. He wanted to watch what would happen next. This wasn't just about removing an unwanted guest. This was entertainment. Ramiro felt rage rise in his chest, white-hot and clarifying, but he forced his face to remain neutral, his body language unchanged. He picked up his knife and fork, watching Ronald's smile widen. Then he set them down again and reached for his water instead. Ronald's smile faltered. Ramiro pulled out his phone, the one hidden in his jacket pocket, the one that had been recording since he walked through those mahogany doors. He typed a single message to Marcus. "It's worse than we thought. They tried to poison me. Get the team inside. Now." He looked at the steak again, at the artful arrangement that concealed rot. He thought of the woman who'd risked everything to warn him, who was probably watching from somewhere in the kitchen, terrified of what came next. He thought of every employee who'd suffered under Ronald's reign, while he, the great Ramiro Bingham, sat in his penthouse office and looked at quarterly reports instead of the human cost beneath them. The scar on his hand pulsed like a second heartbeat. It was time to burn it all down. Ronald moved fast. Too fast. The moment Ramiro set down his silverware without taking a bite, something shifted in the manager's expression. The anticipation curdled into alarm, then calculation. He was across the dining room in seconds, his polished shoes clicking against the marble with military precision. "Is everything all right with your meal, sir?" Ronald's voice was silk over steel, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The concerned manager, attentive to his guest. Ramiro looked up slowly. "I'm not hungry anymore." "Not hungry?" Ronald's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "The ribeye is our signature dish, aged 45 days, seasoned with—" "I said I'm not hungry." The dining room had gone quiet again. the same predatory attention that had followed Ramiro since he walked in. But now they were watching Ronald too, while sensing a confrontation brewing. Ronald's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes flicked to the untouched steak, then to Ramiro's face, searching. Then his gaze landed on something else. Florence, standing near the kitchen door with a water pitcher, her face carefully blank. Ramiro saw the moment Ronald understood. "Florence!" The manager's voice cracked like a whip. "Come here, now!" She approached slowly, the pitcher still in her hands like a shield. Ramiro could see her pulse jumping in her throat. "Did you speak to this gentleman when you served his meal?" Ronald asked, his tone deceptively gentle. Florence's eyes darted to Ramiro, then back to Ronald. I brought him his order, sir." "Did you say anything to him? Anything at all?" Just your ribeye, sir." Ronald smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just found the knife he needed. "Really? Because our guest seemed suddenly uncomfortable with his meal, almost as if someone had said something to upset him." He turned to Ramiro, his voice dripping with false concern. "Sir, I apologize if our server made any inappropriate comments about your situation. We have strict policies about—" "She didn't say anything," Ramiro interrupted. "Are you certain? Because I've had complaints about Florence before. Making our guests uncomfortable with her." Ronald paused delicately. "Her opinions, her judgments about who belongs here and who doesn't." Florence's face went pale. "That's not true. I think it's best if you clean out your locker," Ronald continued, his voice rising to ensure the entire dining room could hear. "Effective immediately. We can't have staff who make our valued guests feel unwelcome." "You're firing her?" Ramiro's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm protecting my establishment's reputation." Ronald turned to Florence, his eyes glittering with triumph. "You're done. Security will escort you out." Florence stood frozen, the water pitcher shaking in her grip. Ramiro could see her calculating. The lost wages, the medication she couldn't buy, the daughter waiting at home. He saw the exact moment her shoulders began to collapse under the weight of it all. "Wait." Ramiro pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against marble. Ronald held up a hand. "Sir, please, let me handle this. I understand you're upset, but—" "I'm not upset." Ramiro reached into his jacket pocket, not for his phone this time, but for something else. A leather wallet, worn but expensive. It was containing an ID card he hadn't needed to show anyone in this restaurant for 3 decades. "I'm disappointed." "Sir, really, there's no need." Ramiro stood, and something in his posture changed. The hunched defeat straightened into authority. The street disappeared from his eyes, replaced by boardroom steel. He held up the ID card, letting the light catch the embossed gold lettering. "My name is Ramiro Bingham," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "And I own this restaurant." Ronald's face went white. The dining room erupted in gasps and frantic whispers. A wine glass shattered somewhere in the back, but Ramiro only watched Ronald, watched the man's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. "You were saying something about my server?" Ronald's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "Mr. Bingham, there's been a misunderstanding. You were just firing the woman who saved my life." Ramiro's voice cut through the stammering like a blade. "The woman who risked her job to warn me that you and your kitchen staff were serving me contaminated meat." The gasps in the dining room turned to shocked murmurs. Ramiro could see phones coming out, recording. Good. Let them record. Let the whole world see what had been festering in his flagship restaurant while he sat in his tower counting profits. That's insane. I would never." Ronald's face had gone from white to red, sweat beading at his temples. "Sir, if there was an issue with the food quality, I assure you—" "Stop." Ramiro held up his hand. Then he bent down and pulled off his right shoe, the battered sneaker held together with duct tape. From inside, he retrieved a phone, not the decoy in his jacket, the real one, smaller, designed for covert recording. Ronald's eyes went wide. "This phone has been recording since I walked through those doors 2 hours ago." Ramiro tapped the screen, and his voice played back, tinny but clear. "I'd like a table." Then Claire's response. "This is a private establishment. The entire confrontation at the hostess stand, preserved in digital clarity." Ramiro scrolled forward. "This is my favorite part." Ronald's voice filled the room, harsh and unmistakable. "That filth out there walked into my dining room, embarrassed my hostess, and made my guests uncomfortable. He wants to play rich? Fine. Let him eat like the rat he is." Someone in the dining room gasped. Another voice whispered, "Oh my God!" Ramiro kept playing. Edward's voice, broken and pleading, "It's against health code. If he gets sick," Ronald on the recording, "if he gets sick, he's a homeless drunk who ate something bad from a dumpster. Who's going to believe him?" The manager stumbled backward, his hand reaching for the bar to steady himself. You can't. That's illegal recording. You can't use..." "Actually, I can." Ramiro pocketed the phone. "Single-party consent state, and I'm the party who consented." He gestured toward the entrance where Marcus had just entered with two other men in dark suits and a woman Ramiro recognized as Detective Sarah Chen from the health department. "I also have witnesses, forensic evidence, and a very unhappy district attorney who's been wanting to make an example out of food safety violations." Ronald's legs seemed to give out. He grabbed a chair to keep from falling. "You tried to poison me because I looked poor." Ramiro's voice was steady, but underneath it was a rage that had been building for 35 years. "You abused your staff. You stole from this restaurant. Yes, I know about the cash you've been skimming. We'll get to that. You created a culture where the Edward Hesters of the world have to choose between their conscience and feeding their families." Marcus and Detective Chen approached, flanking Ronald on either side. "But mostly," Ramiro continued, stepping closer until he was inches from the man's face, "you forgot the most important rule. The one I built this empire on. The one I should have been enforcing from the beginning." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. "Everyone who walks through those doors is human. Everyone deserves dignity. And if you can't see that, you don't deserve to be here." Detective Chen pulled out handcuffs. "Ronald Doxey, you're under arrest for attempted assault, food safety violations, and fraud." As they led him away, Ronald was still stammering, still trying to explain, but his voice faded into nothing, swallowed by the stunned silence of the dining room. Ramiro turned to Florence, who stood frozen with tears streaming down her face. "You're not fired," he said quietly. "You're promoted." The dining room emptied within 15 minutes. The well-dressed guests who'd laughed at Ramiro's humiliation now couldn't leave fast enough, their phones pressed to their ears, already spinning the story they'd tell at tomorrow's brunches. The mahogany doors closed behind the last of them, leaving only silence and the faint smell of extinguished candles. Ramiro stood in the center of it all, still wearing his rags. Through the front windows, he watched the police car pull away with Ronald in the back seat, the man's head bowed, his hands cuffed behind him. Justice served cold on a silver platter. It should have felt satisfying. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Ramiro felt hollow. Florence stood near the bar, Marcus explaining something to her in low tones. Salary, benefits. Was the general manager position that was now hers if she wanted it. She kept touching her face like she couldn't believe the tears were real, kept looking at Ramiro like he was a miracle instead of a man who'd been blind for 35 years. Edward emerged from the kitchen, escorted by another officer. He'd be questioned, charged as an accessory, probably lose his culinary license. His pregnant wife would have to navigate the coming months alone while lawyers decided his fate. He was a good man who'd made a terrible choice, and now he'd pay for it in ways that Ronald's arrest could never balance. How many Edwards were there? How many people had Ronald crushed before tonight? How many had quit, broken, rather than face another day of his cruelty? How many customers had been mistreated, humiliated, driven out because they didn't fit the image Ronald wanted to project? And where had Ramiro been? Counting money, reading reports that blamed market conditions and demographic shifts instead of asking why his flagship restaurant, the one built on dignity and second chances, had become a temple of elitism and casual cruelty. Marcus approached quietly. "The health department will shut us down for at least 3 months. Full investigation, top to bottom. The press is already calling it the poisoned palace." He paused. "It's going to cost millions to recover from this." Ramiro nodded slowly. He'd pay it. He'd pay whatever it took. "What about the other locations?" Marcus asked. The question hit like a punch. Because of course there were other locations. 15 restaurants across 3 states, and each one supposedly built on his founding principle, Each one run by managers he'd promoted based on profit margins instead of character. Each one potentially harboring its own Ronald Doxey, its own culture of cruelty masked by quarterly earnings reports. "Audit them all," Ramiro said, his voice rough. "Every single one. Unannounced visits, anonymous complaints taken seriously. And I want to meet every manager, every sous chef, every server." He looked down at his scarred hand. "No more hiding in the penthouse." Florence walked over, her eyes red but her spine straight. "Mr. Bingham, I can't." She stopped, swallowing hard. "Thank you for believing me, for seeing me." The words broke something in Ramiro's chest. For seeing me. As if basic human recognition was a gift instead of a right. "No," he said quietly. Thank you for being brave enough to do what I should have done years ago." She left with Marcus to sign paperwork to begin the impossible transformation from invisible waitress to general manager. A happy ending, or as close to one as reality allowed. Ramiro walked to the center of the empty dining room and sat down at the table where it had all happened. The poisoned steak had been taken as evidence. Only a water ring remained on the white tablecloth. He pulled out the note Florence had written, unfolded it with careful hands. "Don't eat. The meat is spoiled. Intentional. 6 words from a woman who had everything to lose. 6 words that had saved his life and exposed the rot in his empire." Ramiro sat alone in the restaurant he'd built, surrounded by luxury that had blinded him to suffering, and finally understood the true price of his success. He'd won everything, and he'd almost lost what mattered most. So here's my question for you. If you were sitting in that dining room and saw a homeless man being dragged out while everyone laughed, would you have stayed silent? Would you have pulled out your phone to record it for entertainment, or would you have been the one person who stood up? Here's the truth most of us don't want to admit. We're not Ronald. But we're not Florence either. We're the silent diners, the ones who watch injustice happen and tell ourselves it's not our problem. We see the homeless person being kicked out of the store, the worker being screamed at by their manager, the waitress being treated like she's invisible. And we do nothing. We tell ourselves we didn't cause it, so we don't have to fix it. But silence isn't neutral. Silence is a choice, and every time we choose it, we give people like Ronald permission to keep poisoning the world. Florence had everything to lose, her job, her daughter's medication, her future, and she still chose to be brave. What's your excuse? If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll past it. Share it, not because I need the views, but because someone in your life needs to see that courage doesn't require power or money. It just requires refusing to look away. And if you've ever been the person at that table, invisible, dismissed, treated like you don't matter, drop a comment. Tell your story. Because the moment we stop pretending it doesn't happen is the moment it becomes harder to ignore. The algorithm will only show this to more people if you engage. So comment, subscribe, not for me, but for every Florence out there who's deciding right now whether to stay silent or risk everything. Don't be the silent diner. Be the note. See you in the next story, if you're brave enough to keep watching.